I'll provide a quick introduction to speakers before we get started. But before we get into that, I think it's important to sort of reflect on the urgency of the issues that we're facing, and this session is perhaps going to be a little bit more focused on some of the things that are happening in the climate negotiations around the corner or across the road from here. We're going to be speaking a little bit and reflecting on what's going on over there, and I think that for those of you who are in the negotiations at the moment, I think that what happened in the Subster plenary yesterday afternoon is something that we should be somewhat concerned about when it comes to the recognition of the work that's been done by the IPCC on 1.5 and some of the political considerations that are happening as well. There was, however, a very positive development with the agreement on the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform yesterday as well. So the energy in the room was a bit different to anything that I've ever experienced in the way that it was a big dip and then all of a sudden a high. So it was quite an interesting situation. But moving on, today we have a panel of very experienced UNFCCC veterans. We'll be starting off with Professor Brendan Mackey by video. So something we should, I think, applaud the Global Landscape Forum for in terms of the focus on social media and video, and as things go forward, there's a great hope that these types of events can be held in a way that don't involve significant emissions as we're all trying to come together and discuss some of these tough issues. But Brendan's the director at Griffith University Climate Change Response Program, and he's one of the coordinating lead authors for the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. He's had a long-standing interest in science policy, social ethics, law and sustainability, and I know personally he's been involved in this process and other processes for a very long time. After Brendan's video, we'll be then hearing from Virginia Young, sitting over here to my left. Virginia is the director of the Australian Rainforest Conservation Society Climate and Forest Program and a member of the IUCN Task Force on Primary Forests and Intact Forest Landscapes. And I've personally had the pleasure of knowing and working with Virginia in the climate negotiations for going on a decade now. So our third speaker unfortunately was unable to make it. So Ed Morgan will be standing in his place. So we did have a representative from the Papua New Guinean delegation who's been unable to make it. But Ed and Stanley are both working on the same project essentially, which is a part of the Melanesian Spearhead Group, a forest program. And so we look forward to hearing from Ed in terms of the experiences in Melanesia and the importance of forests and ecosystems across the islands in the Pacific. Thomas Khrushchev, to my right here, is the Polish COP presidency high-level champion. And the previous chair of the SBI, a subsidiary body on implementation, and has been the head of the Polish delegation to the climate change negotiations and chair of the EU delegation. It's a great pleasure to be here, and that Thomas, you were prepared to come along today. And then we'll pass over to Kate Dooley, who's a researcher at Melbourne University with, again, a long-standing history of work on climate and forests, especially in the UNFCCC context. And Kate's also been in this process, I think, for approaching a decade or around 10 years or so. Has played a critical role in terms of coordination of very significant civil society networks, and has recently led on a very interesting and impactful report, which was presented by the Climate, Land, Ambition and Rights Alliance, otherwise known as CLARA. So Kate will speak to that. So having said all of that, if we can tee up the video from Brendan Mackey. So this will be a video from Brendan from Australia.
Mackey, I'm director of the Griffith University Climate Change Response Program, and I'm very pleased to be giving this opening address at our discussion forum today at the Global Landscape Forum 2018. Title of my presentation is The Interdependence of Forests, Ecosystem Integrity and Biodiversity for Climate Change. As we know, the world community faces an enormous task in reducing emissions in the time needed to meet the 2-degree safety bar, let alone the 1.5 degree safeguard. And I'm arguing today that a key part of that necessary mitigation action is forest-based mitigation action. And it can provide us 3 kinds of mitigation benefits. We can, first of all, avoid emissions from protecting forest ecosystem carbon dynamics. We can achieve ongoing sequestration by allowing natural forest ecosystem dynamics to occur. And we can promote enhanced sequestration from forest restoration. Forests can help quite a lot, depending, of course, on how we account for them, but looking at these figures in a very gross way, here is some numbers for 2018, and a net accounting approach yields a difference of about 6.3 gigatons of carbon between emissions from the land sector and their sequestration. A gross accounting approach yields a gross benefit of 16.9 gigatons. So however you add up these numbers, forests can play an important role over a relatively short time period. And in aggregate, of course, looking globally, forests are global significant. Their carbon stocks are globally significant. This graph shows a comparison of total terrestrial ecosystem carbon stocks compared to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and coal and oil and gas, or the known deposits of them. Total deforestation this century would increase atmospheric CO2 by somewhere between 130 to 290 parts per million. So what this suggests is if we were to stop using fossil fuel tomorrow and continue with deforestation and accelerate it such that we achieved that end this century, that alone would be enough to take us over the 2 degree, let alone the 1.5 degree safeguard. This map shows the original distribution of natural forests from about 10,000 years ago in grey, the current distribution of natural forests, and the distribution of large areas of primary forest, intact forest landscapes in the dark green. So we know we've lost about 1/3 of natural forest distribution, and of what left, about 36%, the dark green is in a primary forest state at its maximum natural carbon carrying capacity, and about 64% is degraded to some degree and is below its natural carbon carrying capacity. And we know we're facing ongoing deforestation and degradation everywhere. Here is some MODIS analysis from the Amazon. The deforestation and degradation, which is apparent there, is very well known in the international community. But equally, this is occurring in Southeast Asia and in Africa, and also through the boreal zone. So forest ecosystem carbon stocks are at risk from human land use activity. So let's think a bit more about where the mitigation value of forests actually resides. Well, the actual mitigation value of forests really resides in the accumulated stock of ecosystem carbon rather than short-term flux of carbon dioxide per se. And we know that most of the biomass carbon is in the woody stems and trees and roots of big old trees, plus dead biomass and organic soil. We also know that primary forests store 30 to 70% more carbon than commercially logged forests and plantation forests, depending on how heavily the natural forests have been logged. We also know, and this is the point I really want to focus on in this talk, is that it's the biodiversity of natural forests that provide forest ecosystems with stability and adaptive capacity, which results in longer-lived, denser carbon stocks. So this is to say that not all forests are of equal mitigation value, particularly in the current context, the climate emergency that we face in the coming decades. And the FAO quite helpfully recognises three broad types of forests. Primary forests, forests that are, whose structure and composition and dynamics are dominated by natural processes, though all of these, certainly in the tropics, are the home and have been the home of Indigenous people for millennia. Production forests, which are natural forests which are commercially logged, and plantation forests, planted forests, which are really, if you like, agricultural crops of trees, which are normally harvested around a 10 to 20 year age period. And here I've got some of the criteria, or ecological criteria. We can look at the biodiversity, their ecosystem integrity, their carbon density, their stability, their adaptive capacity, and their longevity. And we can see that these all grade are all high for primary forests, at a medium level for production forests, and at a relatively low level for plantation forests. So let's dig down into what those different characteristics of these three forest types mean. It's been shown in all forest ecosystem types, these data come from a pantropical analysis, that the density of large old trees explains about 70% of the variation in pantropical above ground biomass, and that's some data from the Silk et al. Paper, which shows, the top graph shows this linear relationship between above ground biomass and density of large old trees. And of course, this is a major explanation for why you find more carbon in primary forests and in production forests or in plantations, where the big old trees are over time removed from a commercially logged forest, and they're never allowed to grow old in a plantation forest. And that shows you some of the above ground biomass dominated by large old trees across the three continents. The other interesting new science that we have that's emerged in recent years is that primary forests and old trees themselves keep sequestering. And I've got citations there, quotes there from two citations, one from Lusart et al. Our results demonstrate that old growth forests can continue to accumulate carbon contrary to the long-standing view that they are carbon neutral. These forests alone sequester about 4.8 gigaton of carbon dioxide per year, just from their natural carbon forest dynamics. And the other interesting thing is that old trees themselves continue to stack on carbon, as this paper from Cole et al. Showed. In the last quarter of their lifetimes, the trees they studied accumulated on average between 39 and 15% of their final carbon stock. Old growth trees in tropical forests not only contribute to carbon stocks by long carbon residency time, but maintain high rates of carbon accumulation at later stages of their lifetime. So both of those quotes illustrate research which just shows you how much our knowledge and understanding of forest carbon dynamics is changing. Another aspect of primary forests and their biodiversity that distinguishes them is this high degree of ecosystem integrity. And here the example I'm choosing is in relation to the nutrient cycle, and a quote from a well-known and still interesting paper on nutrient cycling in tropical rainforest by Brouwer and others, where he says that the nutrient cycle of the undisturbed forest is closed. Thus, weathering does not contribute significantly to ecosystem nutrition. The complete nutrient store in the biomass represents an accumulation of atmospheric inputs over many centuries and perhaps even millennia. And this research has been validated and replicated many times in other studies where they've taken the time and put in the effort to do a complete nutrient budget of a tropical forest ecosystem at least. We can also understand better the role that ecosystem integrity plays in maintaining the stability of the forest interior climate. The forest canopy creates a microclimate through attenuating and buffering variation in climatic conditions, creating vertical gradients of radiation and temperature and vapor pressure deficit. So the forest canopy microclimate, it creates a forest interior climate which buffers the forest ecosystem from the effects of drought and heat waves. And we also know now, and I've got some papers cited there which shows how fragmentation leads to edge effects and canopy desiccation. So maintaining the ecosystem integrity provides stability of the microenvironment, which in turn helps maintain the longevity of the carbon stock. And let me also say something about biodiversity and adaptive capacity. And we often forget about this when we talk about forests in generic terms and fail to make this distinction between major types of forests. It's the characteristic of the biodiversity, it's a characteristic evolved biodiversity of these forest ecosystems, which gives them their adaptive capacity. It's natural selection operating on species diversity, on phenotypic diversity that enables micro and macro evolution such that the species, the populations within a species, are able to adapt in a diversity of ways to changing environmental conditions, including the impacts of climate change. And many studies, and this is a well-known one by Barlow et al., just show, and this graph illustrates this, just how much more biodiversity is found in primary forests compared to secondary forests and plantation forests. And with that biodiversity, that species diversity, that genetic diversity, that phenotypic diversity, that provides a greater pool of variability for natural selection to operate on, to find the phenotype and the species that's most suited to the changing environmental conditions, enabling ecosystem processes to continue. This is fundamentally important if we're interested in the maintenance of ongoing forest ecosystem processes in light of the impacts of environmental change, including climate change. Maintaining the biodiversity and maintaining the pool of that diversity, species, taxonomic and phenotypic and genetic, upon which natural selection operates, that is what gives a forest its natural adaptive capacity. So that, in a nutshell, is some of the key relationships between forests and ecosystem integrity and biodiversity, and why all of this together is so important for meeting the climate change mitigation challenge that faces us in the coming decades. I understand that my good colleague Stanley Wappo will be discussing the MSG Forest Program with us, so there's no need for me to talk about this any further, other than to note that Griffith University is very pleased to be collaborating with the MSG on what will be a very important community-based forest conservation program for climate and sustainable development. So let me conclude by suggesting 3 principles for risk management. First of all, it would be very helpful and scientifically more valid and consistent with what we know if national carbon accounts recognised the different forest types we've been discussing, and that they differ in characteristics affecting the stability, resilience and longevity of their carbon stocks, with primary forests representing the lowest risk forest type for climate forest investments. Secondly, governments and donors and funders should prioritise their mitigation actions to reflect the level of risk associated with these different forest types. I'd suggest that scientifically, the highest priority for mitigation actions should go to those forest types that have the lowest risk, which means that we should be investing in programs that improve the monitoring and conservation management of areas of primary forests to prevent deforestation, fragmentation and degradation from industrial scale activities, including commercial logging, mining and agriculture. And a second part of that would be, following protection of primary forests, to prioritise investment in the regeneration of natural forests ahead of investments in new plantations, reflecting this hierarchy of risk associated with the different characteristics of the forest types. And finally, in order to prevent perverse outcomes and to maintain some integrity of environmental accounting at the national level, when investing in regeneration of natural forests, ensure these programs are linked to a commensurate increase in the protection of primary forests. And this is particularly important for those countries which have a higher level of primary natural forest still remaining within the jurisdictional boundaries. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll end my presentation there, and I look forward to our further discussions this morning. Thank you.
Okay, so we are going to be trying to have Brendan on Skype. So there's a bit of an effort going on that part. But the emphasis on ecosystems integrity, I think, is very important. I recall during the Paris negotiations, this question around ecosystems and whether or not there would be able to be anything in the Paris Agreement that reflected ecosystems integrity came up, and there was a lot of questions like, what does it mean? What is it? And there's the outcome was a provision in the preamble of the Paris Agreement that is then linked to Article 5.1. So we're getting into the negotiation speak a little bit, but turning to Virginia. So Brendan does talk a lot there about ecosystems integrity. I think there are a number of questions out there as to what it is and what it means in the climate negotiations that are currently happening at the moment. It'd be nice to hear from you as to whether or not you feel that there's sufficient emphasis on this topic in the negotiations. So yeah, over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve, and thank you to C4 for organising what I think is an extremely important event at a critical time. The short answer to your question, Steve, is absolutely almost zero attention to the issue of ecosystem integrity and the role that biodiversity plays in actually underpinning ecosystem integrity. So despite the call in the preamble, which is actually directly linked to the convention itself, it reflects Article 4.1D, I think it is, of the convention. So it's picking up a concept from the convention about how important it is to protect, to conserve and enhance, in UNFCCC language, reservoirs which are stocks of ecosystem carbon, and it applies to all ecosystems. The convention's really clear. The preamble to the Paris Agreement applies to all ecosystems, as does Article 5, which applies to ecosystems, including forests. That there has never been a work program to operationalise this intent in the convention, and it's completely missing in action from the climate negotiations so far, which is tragic when you consider that the IPBES, which is the same as the equivalent of the IPCC for the Climate Convention, it's the advisory body to the Convention on Biodiversity, has called on the world to treat the climate crisis the biodiversity crisis as seriously as it treats the climate crisis. And that's because we've got ecosystems already in collapse, ongoing, quite shocking degradation and fragmentation of a range of natural ecosystems that are just as serious for the fate of life on Earth as the climate crisis. And when you have the climate crisis coming in on top of that past damage and fragmentation, we really have to change our attitude to the protection and restoration of all our natural ecosystems. So, unfortunately, that's a conversation we're yet to have in the UNFCCC.
And you've just, you're one of the few people, when you talk in the climate negotiations, I've noticed when you talk about issues that are addressed by other conventions, I know that this has been, a body of work was done around World Heritage a number of years ago, and in the World Heritage Convention, and the climate topic came up, and it was deferred to the UNFCCC. And when you talk about biodiversity in the UNFCCC, it's essentially deferred to the CBD, or the Convention on Biological Diversity. It'd be good to hear from you in terms of your thoughts on the way that the conventions cooperate with one another, and whether you have any ideas around where things could go in terms of enhancing the synergies between some of these conventions and how that may apply to the Paris Agreement.
Yes, well, I'm not alone at all in thinking that there are some very big gaps starting to appear between the three big conventions that impact biodiversity and ecosystem integrity: the Convention on Desertification, the Convention on Biodiversity, and the Climate Convention. And there certainly are things falling through the cracks. The need for far greater integration between what they're calling the three biodiversity-related conventions was actually one of the major decisions that came out of the Convention on Biodiversity just a couple of weeks ago. And there's a separate decision from the CBD on the links between climate and biodiversity, recognising that while climate is a threat to biodiversity, so too is ongoing degradation, fragmentation and damage of ecosystems a threat to the climate. And so those interdependencies must be recognised and dealt with. Now, you know, one idea I've been mulling over is whether or not we actually need a joint work program between the UNFCCC and the CBD and perhaps the CCD as well. But things must change or we won't solve the climate crisis because the biodiversity crisis will take us out first.
Thanks. I was speaking with a colleague who works in toxics and pesticides conventions, and I think they come together for a super COP every now and then. So there are precedents out there where different conventions come together and work more collaboratively. But we'll turn to you now, Ed, in taking Stanley's place. It'd be good to hear from the ground just a little bit more about the work that you're doing across the islands in the Pacific, and how that sort of focuses on sort of biodiversity and so linkages between biodiversity and climate, so experiences that you're having from the work on the ground there.
Sure. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for coming along. My apologies on behalf of Stanley, who could probably do this far better than I can. However, seems to have gone missing in action. I know they're staying quite a way out of the city, and I don't know whether Sunday traffic or Sunday public transport is anyway. But I've been working closely with Stan and also with Virginia and Brendan, who you just heard from, and we're putting together a program of work really around trying to protect primary forests in Melanesia. And so the Melanesian case is really interesting. We tend to think of the Pacific as islands, and there's a focus on oceans and coasts for obvious reasons. But actually Melanesia has substantial forest cover. And the forests are really important to Melanesians and Melanesian culture, which is something people from the outside, like myself, don't necessarily recognise and appreciate. These countries, so for those that don't know, I should probably clarify, the Melanesian countries are Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu and Fiji, and also New Caledonia, but it's not officially because it's French. And yeah, these countries' forests are substantial areas of primary forests, and the important thing, sort of zooming out from this, or zooming down from this very global view from the UNFCCC to the very local, people live in these forests, and people grow their food in these forests or on the edges of these forests and around these forests. And actually these forests and their biodiversity and their ecological integrity are fundamental to an entire culture, really. But you know, on a more practical basis, their way of life in terms of growing their food. So our focus has very much been, and as we discuss with stakeholders and we go and talk to people, they always come back to us and said, well, if you're thinking about forests, you have to think about people, and you can't separate the two. So our focus is very much on supporting communities, helping communities to look after their forest, which they know how to do and have been doing for centuries, but trying to harness the benefits. So there are these biodiversity benefits, there are all these ecosystem benefits that we've just seen. And we are trying to focus on how do we get these communities to benefit from that.
Great, thanks. And I think it's really it's a really exciting piece of work that's going on there across the Pacific. And most of the emphasis on forests is usually looking at the tropical forest countries, and so you know, Indonesia and Peru and Brazil is the countries really in the and receiving most of the funding as well when it comes to the disbursement of a very limited pool of funds, and so it's quite an exciting piece of work that's happening there. So we'll cross over to and go back to go back into the sort of negotiation space a little bit, and to Thomas here. The Polish presidency is planning to make an announcement, I understand, here during the course of next week related to forests. Is it possible to provide any insights? You may not be able to go into a great deal of information because it hasn't happened yet, but yeah, if there's any insights that you can provide in terms of the direction of travel for this declaration that's being discussed at the moment.
Well, I don't want to make a presentation of this declaration because it is going to be a little bit of celebration on Wednesday, I believe. Well, this declaration is a result of certain observation. And the observation is very much in line with what Virginia has just said, that despite of its extremely important role for preserving biodiversity, for both mitigation and adaptation, forests are somehow underestimated, and the attempts to include forests in the mainstream of the negotiations and the mainstream of action is usually opposed by those who are saying, well, the forests are just growing, and how do you want to benefit from what the nature is doing for you? Well, it's probably not 100% correct, such a view. And of course, there is an old saying that if you don't know what the whole story is all about, it's about money. This is exactly the case. This is exactly the case because, of course, money is limited, and there is some kind of competition who gets this money first and who will benefit at the cost of whom. We had forests from the beginning in the UNFCCC. We understand the need to conserve biodiversity, enhance it, but we somehow forget about the fact that the biosystem, the climate system, is the kind of integrated system of interlinkages between various components, and each of the components is equally important. It is equally important to address atmospheric carbon, to address hydrosphere, geosphere, and biosphere if you want to address overall problem that we are now having with climate. Otherwise, it simply won't work. If the balance between the four components of climate system, as the convention says, by the way, how many people in these negotiations read the convention carefully? That would be a nice research to do.
That's it's true.
If we want to address the system as such, we must not forget about the fact that there are certain components and the interlinkages between these components. And components and the interlinkages got distorted by human action. Got distorted by deforestation, got distorted by overexploitation of oceans, got distorted by waste pollution, got distorted by excessive use of fossil fuels, got distorted by our style of life.
Thanks. And in terms of, so this point that was raised by Virginia, when it comes to more emphasis on biodiversity within the UNFCCC, and I recall being at a session that was convened by you as the high-level champion in Bonn during the course of this year at the SB session, where there was a discussion around where to next. And so there's been the negotiations around REDD+ that have taken us some of the way, and Article 5 in the Paris Agreement is, as much as 5.2 is intended to be referring to REDD+, Article 5.1 is a much broader article. And so it'd be good to hear from you any advice that you may have, perhaps in terms of approaches that could be taken, especially as the former chair of the SBI, around implementation and a veteran. How do you think work could be done in order to be really operationalising Article 5 of the Paris Agreement, as well as whether there's any potential for greater synergies between the UNFCCC and other conventions, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity?
Well, I would have also added the Convention on combating desertification, Ramsar Convention, and a few others. We've got a lot of conventions, we have a lot of good ideas, but these ideas don't talk to each other. The conventions only talk sometimes on, let's say, administrative level, rather than on the level of the bodies of the convention, when actual people representing parties talk to each other. That's very difficult. I remember I was trying to initiate this kind of dialogue between SABSTA when I was chairing SABSTA back in 2015, and with the similar body of the Convention to Combat Desertification. That was a nightmare. That was close to impossible. Everybody agreed, nobody knew how to do it. We have the solution, I believe, right now, after Paris. And this solution is called Global Climate Action Agenda. And this is the kind of, it's becoming kind of parallel world to what the intergovernmental process is doing and what the intergovernmental process is able to deliver. As a matter of fact, what the Global Landscape Forum is doing, what the organizations here are doing, is exactly an example of kind of what I call Nike approach, that just do it. This is exactly what we need. The negotiations, they are having its own dynamics. You've experienced this dynamics yesterday night at SABSTA. Well, we need a little bit of drama, we need a little bit of emotions, we need a little bit of showing off. Let's not forget that if we cut off webcast, 90% of the drama would have disappeared. Well, people need to demonstrate back home how strongly they fight for national interests. Fine. That's the beauty of the negotiations. That's what diplomats do. We have the instructions and we have to follow them. But on the ground, there is life, and this life cannot wait. And what Global Climate Action Agenda, Marrakesh Partnership offers is this opportunity to do the things without waiting for anybody's decision, without waiting for anybody's permission. Just do what is the right thing to do.
Thank you. And speaking of intergovernmental processes and getting on and just doing it, Kate, I'll turn to you. The IPCC report was coming out and focusing on 1.5, and there was a certain level of emphasis on certain topics, and you're part of a large civil society network that involves scientists and a number of different organisations that went ahead and prepared a report which is looking at missing pathways. And so this was identifying, as I understand, gaps in what the IPCC was looking at, specifically in the context of land and people. Now, I believe that Kate has a couple of slides, but I'll pass over to you, Kate, to perhaps just talk us through the Clara report, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. So yes, this report came from CLARA, the Climate, Land, Ambition and Rights Alliance, which is an alliance of organisations working on forests, agriculture and land rights, so quite a broad spectrum of issues in the land sector. And this report was sort of conceived of and delivered in the context of over this year while the IPCC 1.5 report was being developed, and we felt that the way land was treated in that there's a lot of reliance on land for mitigation in the 1.5 report, but there's not a lot of emphasis on biodiversity or land rights. So as Brendan and previous speakers have said, the best way that it's important to link climate and biodiversity to deal with both those issues, and we think the best way to link those is through respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So in this report we tried to quantify the mitigation potential in the forest sector and in the agriculture sector of actions that really respected biodiversity and land rights. So I do have a slide that would be really good to show, because otherwise I'm going to have to give you a lot of numbers to just remember in your head. I'm not sure if it's coming up or not. People with the slide look confused, so people at the computers look confused. So I'll just try and explain it, but I urge you all to look at the report, because then you will be able to see the visuals. So we started off in this report looking at the collectively held lands globally, and there's some recent research from Rights and Resources Initiative and Woods Hole, which mapped out the carbon stored, quantified the carbon stored in 64 countries in tropics and also northern and southern hemispheres, so not just the tropics but globally, and found at least in those 64 countries, in collectively managed lands that can be identified, at least 293 gigatons of carbon is stored in those forests. Now, a lot of that carbon is at risk because those collectively held lands do not have secure tenure rights. So in the tropics, at least a third of that carbon is at risk. And that's obviously a huge underestimate of the amount of carbon stored in these lands, because lack of data and not all countries are included, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, what we did is, so for the forest sector, we took the concept of building a little bit on what Brendan was talking about. What would the mitigation value be if we returned half the world's forests back to primary intact ecosystems? And so that would be currently about 25% of productive forests, not plantations, but production natural forests, taken out of production and returned back to allow to restore to intact, healthy, functioning ecosystems. And that also aligns with many declarations and demands coming out of various Indigenous peoples' organisations for more land to be allowed to be left under Indigenous management. The mitigation value of that, as well as a small amount of forest regeneration. So again, one of Brendan's concluding points was that for any forest regeneration must also prioritise protecting primary forest ecosystems. So doing both of those together, we came up with 9 gigatons of CO2 a year could be sequestered. Along with avoiding deforestation, which you would have to do this kind of restoration, that was another, and restoring peatlands gave another 6 gigatons of CO2 avoided. And in the agriculture sector, we focused a lot on work that had been done by Greenpeace and some other work showing that producing less food, but particularly less livestock, so less meat and dairy production, but also producing that better, as well as techniques such as agroecology, but things that fall under that, such as agroforestry, could deliver, I think it was 8 gigatons a year in avoided emissions and sequestration. Now, what I wanted to show you in the graphic that you can't see, so you'll have to imagine it, is we've got here 8 gigatons mitigation potential from the agriculture sector, 15 roughly from the gigaton CO2 mitigation potential in sequestered and avoided emissions from the forest sector, and over 1,000 gigatons of CO2 stored in Indigenous held lands. So that really dwarfs, those are very significant mitigation potentials in forests and agriculture, but the carbon already residing in collectively managed lands really dwarfs that potential. And so protecting that carbon and respecting those land rights and those people is obviously the utmost priority. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Kate, and apologies about the slides. There seems to have been a bit of confusion there, but I understand that they are on their way to the computer as we speak from another source. So maybe we can turn to the. So I'll leave it with our friends over there. But perhaps we can turn to the audience. We have a very packed agenda today, and so we'll be moving through these sessions at a rate of knots. For those who sail out there, you'll understand what I mean by that. But we probably have time for perhaps three questions from the audience for the panelists. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask, or points that you'd like to, or comments you'd like to make? Okay, so the first hand that went up was at the back there in the checkered shirt, I think. So towards the back, yeah, thanks. Just introduce who you are as well, and where you're from. That might be nice too, thanks.
Very good. I'm Peter Riggs from Pivot Point, and also working with the Climate, Land, Ambition and Rights Alliance, CLARA. If you'd like to see the executive summary and this mythical graph that Kate spoke to, I have some copies of that. The executive summary of that report in French, Spanish, English, and Portuguese. My question or my comment concerns the IPCC 6th assessment. We've seen a couple of the special reports already that have come out from that assessment cycle, which we should welcome, and in fact should be the basis of the.
I don't think there's any disagreement in this room, but.
But one other undertaking in the 6th assessment cycle has been a look at the IPCC rules, accounting rules, dealing with forests. And unfortunately, this is talked about only as a refinement. That is not a fundamental look at these rules. And so this is a question and also a challenge to C4. It seems to us that a lot could be done in improving the accounting rules. A lot of what Virginia spoke about in terms of recognizing the value of primary forest should be reflected in those accounts. We'd like to see wood pellets, the fastest growing and most damaging section of the so-called bioeconomy. We're seeing wood pellets moved around the globe now, being burned in coal legacy infrastructure, extremely harmful. None of that is showing up in the accounts. So my question to C4 and others is, what can we do to move beyond the refinement and get to a better set of accounting rules that actually will do a better job reflecting what the atmosphere sees in terms of land use change, forest destruction, as well as forest restoration? Thank you.
Thank you. And so the next fastest person to have their hand up was in the front here, and perhaps another show of hands so that we can find another perhaps a quick other show of hands before you. I'd like to this is all. I'm going for some gender balance here, if at all possible. This is, no, so Christoph, you'll go next. Okay, so. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Faisal Parish from Global Environment Center from Malaysia. Kate, I'd like you for thank you for highlighting the issue of peatlands, and I was a bit interested in Brendan Mackey's comment that the terrestrial carbon store was only about 800 gigatons. And I think that if we include peatlands, we are significantly more than that, because we're talking about 550 to 600 gigatons for peatlands alone. And peatlands are emitting much more than their share. They're really the hotspot, and the most cost-effective, one of the most cost-effective, is to reduce the emissions by rewetting and restoration. So in Southeast Asia, we are generating, in the bad years, 2 to 4 gigatons of emissions from burning and drainage of peatlands. And I think this is one of the things which we've really struggled to get it really front and center in the climate negotiations. There's too much focus on the trees and not on the forest and ecosystems. And I think anything we can do to really bring these cost-effective and other ways to reduce emissions by focusing on the hotspots of emission sources and those which have the most potential to address. So maybe the panel can comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then we'll pass over to Christoph over in the front corner here. Perhaps. Thank you.
Good morning. Christoph Thies from Greenpeace. I have a question for Thomas on the forest declaration. I understand that you might not be able to speak too much on it in detail and that we should all wait for Wednesday. But just want to convey a concern that we are having, judging from the existing drafts, to say it bluntly, that it could, we see some risk that this forest declaration could rather turn out to be a logging declaration. In other words, you know, putting much more emphasis on logging and the role of timber in comparison to the very important forest sink. So don't get me wrong, we do not see the risk that you are planning to turn your Polish forest sink into a source, but we are very worried that your sink would be way lower than actually it could be. And as we have, for instance, as Greenpeace, modeled for Germany, the potential for all our forest sinks in Germany and Europe, I would say indeed all over the world, in secondary forests, to be way larger than it currently is. So we have to find a good balance between wood and the forest. And there I'm picking up on Peter, as Greenpeace is also a member of the Clara Alliance, that of course wood really needs to go into long-lived products and not into bioenergy. Maybe, you know, at the end of product chains, remnants or waste streams, there's maybe some potential, but we should not phase out coal and burn forests instead.
Thanks very much. So we don't really have the time to be taking any more questions. We'll go to the panelists now. Perhaps starting with you, Thomas, if you don't mind, and then we can move along and others can address them. Kate, you can perhaps even talk to your slides slightly at the end. So I'll pass over to you, Thomas.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the question. I think it's a very important one. Let me put it this way. Well, first of all, I 100% agree, forests are not the plantations of biomass for energy from biomass, that's for sure. We experienced such attempts, and these attempts have been rejected. It's simply not happening. I mean, there is certain biomass that has to be taken out of the forest for various reasons, including fire protection, but this is just limited. And we, by the way, don't think that just burning biomass is the best way to deal with this. But this is a different story. Well, personally, I feel that the declaration could have been stronger, personally. But it's always some kind of compromise. And I'm really happy to engage in dialogue with you and other colleagues as soon as possible, maybe tomorrow, just to make sure that we can explain this declaration in a way it should be read, it should be understood. I don't think we can do much about the text itself, because this is, as I said, some kind of outcome of consultations. So it has to include as many as possible. It's not the declaration that everybody would subscribe to, I'm afraid, but we want to have as many as possible. And maybe this is the declaration that could be a very good kind of starting point for conversation. Maybe this is this acknowledgement that we are not doing enough to implement Article 5. In fact, the discussion about implementation of Article 5 is non-existent. We have the RED Plus framework that I'm personally very much attached to from Warsaw COP, and that's it. And how about 5.1? How about other forests? How about the role of forest and its linking potential with the Convention on Combating Desertification and Biodiversity and the Ramsar? And that's something that I'm happy to engage in the conversation about, and well, we'll fix them. Thank you.
Great. It sounds like the GLF is working in its mandate and bringing people together. So that sounds like a meeting that we can discuss it further today. So perhaps we'll pass over to our colleagues on the left. Who would like to go first in terms of responding?
Well, I'm really very interested in the peatland point because I think it's very valid, and I'm sure Professor Mackey would see the validity in that as well. And it's part of the reason we need to consider ecosystems more generally and not just the forests. So the same could apply in mangrove systems, a whole range of quite carbon-dense, critical ecosystems for a whole range of ecological functions. So that's a very good point that you've made. I don't know, do you want to talk about the accounting case? Do you want me, we could both. It was an accounting question from Peter about what needs to change on...
yeah, Peter actually directed the question to C4, so I think we should...
Maybe we can tee up a meeting with between Peter and someone
we'll tee up a meeting
who's
but I think... I think Thomas has just also very well highlighted the point about bioenergy. The forests need to not be harvested for bioenergy, and I think some of Brendan's points around clearly showing those distinctions between primary forest, production forest, and plantation forest is, in a way, the simplest way we could go in the direction of dealing with the bioenergy problem if we started to see plantations separately from forests, and then understand that harvesting forests for bioenergy is going to deplete the carbon stock and so has no mitigation value. Without going into accounting rule details, which I don't think the 2019 refinement has fixed, and nor has this process taken any steps towards fixing, I think that a bigger understanding of forests and their ecological role is how we could start to solve that. On the peatlands, I just wanted to quickly say, and there's experts in this room on peatlands far beyond my knowledge, but in the Clara report, people who are listening closely will have heard me say that we counted 6 gigatons CO2 of avoided emissions from forests and peatlands, which is greater than is currently included in the global carbon budget as emissions from those sectors. And that's because peatland emissions are not well captured in the global carbon budget. So we used a recent study that showed almost 2 gigatons CO2 equivalent of peatland emissions, which is less from globally, which is less than what you just pointed out. But the global carbon budget only uses emissions from Indonesia and from burning and has less than 1 gigaton CO2. So the scale of peatland emissions is not recognised, but even more importantly is intact peat, wetlands and peatlands in terms of not disturbing those. So it's definitely a huge part of the carbon budget. And just finally, you can see my slides are up here. So the very simple point is that bar right on the left that really dwarfs the mitigation figures that are very significant and ambitious mitigation figures, but the bar on the left is the amount of CO2 equivalent that would be stored in collectively held lands.
And just one little point that relates to the accounting challenge. The real failure was the failure to differentiate between forests when the definition of forests was developed, and that is a profound failure. So treating all forests as equal in the definition is the root cause of the problems that we now face.
Yeah, well, just maybe just one quick point about the accounting. Well, I think it's one of the reasons why people are so sensitive about the inclusion of forests to wider picture of accounting of emissions and emission reductions, because this understanding of what is this additionality is not well spread, it's not well communicated, and this is probably one of the challenges ahead of us, that if we want to change it, if we want to have forestry somehow included in the bigger picture, we have to make sure that firstly methodology is well understood, secondly is well communicated, and thirdly it could be verified.
Okay, Brendan wanted to. Brendan's on Skype apparently that wanted to add to it. Okay, so I'll hand the microphone over to Peg.
He said
He said, be my guest. So, you know, it's in relation to the accounting question. And in his presentation, he did raise that it's not just about flows, it's actually about stocks of carbon. And he's written a paper with Judith Ajani, which we can supply the reference for through C4, on comprehensive stock and flow accounting, which, you know, begins to go some way towards resolving this issue where of having a balance sheet as well as a profit and loss statement, basically, for the forests and for natural systems for accounting. There's more obvious that needs to be covered in terms of resilience and so on, but he's pointing to that on the Skype, and he's also saying, yes, of course, peat is important, but so are big old trees. So, you know, both things.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Brendan, if you can hear this, and thanks, Peg. So that's all we have time for on this panel. And so if we can have a round of applause for our panelists. And thank you very much to everybody for participating.